Good morning. Dadgummit, that's weak. Good morning. Yes, there we go. I like it. I want you to scream at me, believe it or not, sometimes. You can go ahead and be grabbing your Bible and be turning to Acts chapter 23. We are getting ready to wind down our series on the book of Acts, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. A statement that I've made multiple times already, but I want to make again is, it is so amazing to me how I can read the same passages. And really, when you think about it, we've been studying the same Bible all of our lives. For some of us, we've been studying the Bible for decades. And it's amazing to me how every single time you open the Bible, you can read the same passages and you can make a totally different application each and every time. And it just continues to work on you. It continues to mold you. It continues to shape you. And my hope for you is that you never get to a point when you're content with where you're at as a Bible student. It's my hope that you never get to the point where you're content with your knowledge of the Bible, that you never get to the point where you feel like you know enough that you no longer have to be a student. It is also my hope that you never get to the point where somebody gets up here on Sunday morning and someone talks about a passage that we're going to be looking at and studying, and you go, my goodness, I've heard that passage a million times. I hope that never happens, because God's word is powerful, and God's word will show you something different every single time if you will let it. There in Acts chapter 23, there's a lot that's gone up to this point. And as I mentioned last week, starting in about chapter 22, and we're really digging into the meat here in chapter 23 on through the end of the book in chapter 28, that if I were to pick a theme of what we're going to see throughout the rest of the book of Acts, it is God's provisions. It is the very providence of God. It is the way God works in the life of his servant, in this case, his servant Paul, and how God is always coming in and working through, not miracle. We know the difference in miracle and providence, right? We've talked about that a lot. How God, through natural occurrences, through things that we can explain on earth, something that's not supernatural, but something that is natural, how God is coming in the life of Paul, and he is doing something amazing. The way that he's working through Paul, again, not miraculously, but providentially. And we see the very same thing happen here in Acts chapter 23. And there's three things, by the way, I want you to notice. I don't have them up here on the screen. But there are three things that I want you to be paying attention for and looking for here in this sermon. And the first one of them is how it really all boils down to the counsel of the Jews versus the wisdom of Paul. And you'll see that clash, and that's what it really boils down to. Again, the counsel of the Jews versus the wisdom of Paul. I also want you to notice how Paul goes about protecting his servant. In this case, again, Paul. I want you to notice how it is providentially, and we're going to make some application there later in the sermon before we close out. I also want you to take note of the fact that God uses a group that you wouldn't think he would use to go about carrying out his purpose, and that group is the Romans. I want you to note how God goes through Rome, and it seems as though Rome is used as a tool to carry out the purpose of God. And so let's talk about this first point here, standing before the council. Again, as Paul is standing before the council, you can imagine that for many of us that'd be pretty overwhelming. Paul is standing in front of a group of people who don't like him. In fact, we're going to see later on in this very book that they want him dead. They don't like Paul at all. They hate him. They hate his message. And there's also something else I want to take note of, and this isn't something I like talking about and bringing up, by the way. But have you noticed a pattern in the issues that the apostles had through the book of Acts? And have you noticed that what it really all boils down to is the fact that the Jewish community doesn't want to let go of some of their traditions? Have you noticed that? It's kind of a scary thought for some of us. That because the Jewish community refused to let go of some of their quote-unquote traditions, that Paul had to go through all that he did because they just would not let go of some things that they had been doing for a very, very long time. And so standing before the council, first of all, let's talk about a clear conscience that we know Paul had. Again, next slide here. Let's read verses 1 and 2 together. It says, Paul, looking intently at the council, said, "Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day." The high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. I know we didn't get very far, but let's stop right there. There are a few things that I noticed here in verses 1 and 2. I first want you to take notice of the fact that Paul says in verse 1, making the statement, "I have lived with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this point." Now, the reason I find that so interesting is who just made that statement. Someone who was a murderer, right? Someone who killed Christians. Someone who was a great persecutor of the church, perhaps the greatest persecutor of the church before his conversion. So here's a man who has murdered Christians, who is standing before a group of people who know exactly who he was, and they were in agreement. They approved of what Paul did. And here's Paul, again, a man who's done all of this, making a statement before the council, and he says, "I have lived with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day." Isn't that interesting? How can a murderer live with a perfectly good conscience? You find that interesting? You ever done something and you regretted it? My goodness, you'd give anything to take it back. Maybe it was something you said to a person. Maybe it was the way you handled a certain situation and you hate that you handled it the way that you did. Or maybe you did something behind someone's back or something behind the scenes and maybe no one ever even knew you did it. Maybe it was something that only you knew about and you felt so bad about it. You were guilty and you hated it and your conscience was just eating you alive, and maybe you got to the point where your conscience was bothering you so bad you had to tell somebody. Does anybody else Can anybody else relate to that situation? I know I can. It's just eating you up to the point you felt like you had to tell somebody. And again, here is a murderer, a former murderer, persecutor of the church, whom he's now preaching to, saying, "I've lived with a perfectly good conscience." Here's the point, here's the application that I want to make for you and I. If a murderer can stand before this council, if Paul can stand before God himself and say, "I've lived with a perfectly good conscience," knowing that God had forgiven what he did, that's where the power of this message comes in. Paul understood that the grace of God could cover even what we consider to be the worst of sins. So here's the application. If a murderer can stand before God with a perfectly clear conscience, knowing that the grace of God is greater than sin, you, whatever it is that you've done, maybe it's really, really bad, I don't know. But if Paul can do that, being who he was, you can do the very same thing. You can stand before your God with a clear conscience because you know that his grace is sufficient. You know that his grace reaches you also. Another point I want to make here, you look in verse 2. After Paul makes that statement in verse 2, it says, "The high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth." Isn't that interesting? It doesn't seem like something that would be worthy of getting slapped on the face for. Why do you think that is? Well, think about it. Paul's standing before this council who has all these charges against him, treating him like a criminal. Here's a man saying, "I've lived with a perfectly good conscience." Would you not agree that Paul's saying he's lived with a good conscience, in other words, he feels pure, he feels innocent, is kind of offensive to those who are treating him as a criminal? They were offended by it. To say that Paul, well, first of all, Ananias really couldn't prove much. He couldn't prove that what Paul's claims, what he's going to say throughout his defense, he can't prove that they're not true because he knows them to be true. And here's Paul saying, "I'm innocent," in front of a man who's charging him as a criminal. And because he was offended, he was angry, he orders Paul to be smacked on the mouth. That's interesting. Let's go on here to the next couple of verses, a couple of things in the text. Talk about being rebuked there in verses 3, 4, and 5. We see a few different situations being rebuked, a few different people. First of all, it says, "Then Paul said to him in verse 3, 'God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall.'" Boy, that's something. "Do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck?" But the bystanders said, "Do you revile God's high priest?" And Paul said, "I was not aware, brethren, that he was the high priest. For it is written, 'You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people.'" Now there's another message here that I also want to point out. So after ordering him to be struck on the mouth, Paul is speaking out against the high priest, whom we find out from the text he didn't know was the high priest at the time. He says, "Who are you? Are you really going to order me to be struck as you're sitting here lecturing me about violating the law when what you just did was in violation of the law, you hypocrite?" Then the people point out to him that Ananias, whom he's just rebuked, is the high priest. And I want you to notice how Paul reacts to that. Notice what Paul says. He says, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was high priest. For it is written that you shall not speak evil, you shall not do evil against the high priest, against the ruler of the people." Paul is apologizing for something we would probably say he shouldn't have to apologize for, right? He's apologizing for something that we see as he was probably in the right for saying what he did. That's how we would see that. And sometimes don't we treat the way we go about things the same way? We talk to someone a certain way, and maybe we get really, really harsh, and then afterwards maybe we feel bad about it, and then someone says, "No, you shouldn't feel bad. They deserved everything that they got." But when I see Paul and the way that he reacts to this man, and the fact that he apologizes after the fact, knowing that this was the high priest, first of all, this is old law. I find that so interesting that Paul tries his very, very best to keep the old law as well, as long as it doesn't violate the new covenant. We know that the old law had already been done away with, but Paul tries his very best to appease the Jews by continuing to follow the commandments of the old law. There's another application for us, don't you think? There's another application. Sometimes we're going to have to do things we really don't want to do in order to appease people that we feel are in the wrong. Sometimes you're going to have to do things, and you're not going to want to do them. It's not in your best interest. It's not something you're interested in, but we're going to have to do it in order to appease people. Dissension, next slide here, starting in verse 6. Let's read on. It says, "But perceiving that one group were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, 'Brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead.' And he said, as he said this, there occurred a dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. And there occurred a great uproar. And some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, 'We find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him.' And as a great dissension was developing, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. But on the night immediately following, the Lord stood at his side and said, 'Take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, you must witness at Rome also.'" The text tells us as Paul perceived that he was speaking to Pharisees as well as Sadducees, we know that there were some very clear differences in the way that they believe. The text right here tells us what those differences were. The Sadducees say that there was no resurrection of the dead, nor that there was nor angels nor spirits in verse 8. But the Pharisees, the text tells us, acknowledge them all. And it's interesting that as Paul perceives that he's speaking to Pharisees and Sadducees, that he brings up, he makes a very, very controversial statement, to say the very least. He decided that he was going to say something very controversial in order to get the two groups going against each other, and that their focus would be less on dealing with him treacherously the way that they were wanting to, and that they would be focused on winning argument with each other. Now, does that sound crazy to you? I'll tell you what's even crazier. It worked. It worked. They're over here butting heads, and they're going against each other, and it's like they've forgotten about Paul for the moment. I also want you to notice something in verse 9 of our text. I want you to notice that the Pharisees, that those of the Pharisaic party, they stood up and they began to argue after Paul makes a statement. And they say, "We find nothing wrong with this man," in verse 9. They find no fault in him. So let's lay out what's going on. So here is Paul in a bogus trial, by the way. I'm sure you've picked up on that. A bogus trial. Even those who are accusing him of all of these charges, it says the Pharisees right here can find no fault in him. Does this sound familiar at all to you? Does it sound familiar? Does it sound anything like maybe our Lord's trial? A garbage trial, a bogus trial, a trial that should never have happened in the first place. And even some of his accusers are saying we find no fault in him. Sounds very familiar to me. There was dissension going on. And this is the first instance, by the way, the thing I wanted you to be looking out for, one of the few things, where Paul uses the Romans as a tool to lead to the rescue of Paul. Here, I don't know if you caught that or not, but it says that the Roman commander, verse 10, was afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them and ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. And so we may not realize it, but Paul has just been saved by none other than the Romans. There's another point I want to make here that I haven't made yet. Maybe you've already made the point in your mind. I don't know. Sometimes God works through people that we would look at and go, I can't believe it. I don't think God would ever really work through that person or through that person. Sometimes in the Bible we see God working through people that it absolutely amazes us. I'm reminded of a situation, even in different Old Testament books, where God works through a group of people that we wouldn't see as the kind of people that God would be working through. Paul is rescued. He's taken by the Roman troops into the barracks. Again, God works through the Romans. Do you think God had a hand in this matter? Absolutely. Be thinking about that, because that's going to be a recurring theme. Next point here, let's talk about conspiracy in verses 12 through 22. An oath and a plan here. Next slide. Starting in verse 12, let's go ahead and read on in our text. Verse 12. It says, when it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who formed this plot. They came to the chief priests and the elders and said, we have bound ourselves under a solemn oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. Now therefore you and the council notify the commander to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case by a more thorough investigation. And we, for our part, are ready to slay him before he comes near to the place. So as I've mentioned, they don't like Paul. And not only do they not like Paul, they hate Paul to the point where they're ready to kill Paul. And again, I go back to this point because I think it's important. Why do they feel the way that they do about Paul? Because they feel that Paul is speaking out against what? Some of their traditions. You'll notice some language being used not only in this text, but in other texts as you walk through the book of Acts. The Jews referring to the old law as our ways. You'll notice that they say our ways, or our teachings, or our laws, our statutes, our commandments, whatever. They've turned it into, it's ours. It belongs to us. It's something that we own. It's ours. It's our whatever. Because Paul is speaking out against, there's that T word again, their traditions, they're fired up and ready to kill Paul. Do we have traditions today? Absolutely we do. Do we have some traditions that there's nothing wrong with them? They're perfectly fine? Absolutely. But if you ask me and want me to be completely honest, and I feel convicted to do so because I think the text would have me to do so, not only here but in other places, do I believe we have some traditions we should probably be letting go of? Absolutely. Because if we're not careful, what we do is we let traditions dictate some things moving forward. We let our traditions dictate the way that we go about doing certain things, and it gets in the way of God's purpose for us. Because Paul is speaking out against their traditions. They form this plan, this plot to kill him. They even take an oath, saying, we're not going to eat nor drink anything. We're not going to let anything come into our mouth until we have him killed. They did not like Paul. They were ready for him to be dead. But starting in verse 16, next slide here, we see this conspiracy exposed. Conspiracy exposed. In verse 16 it says, but the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, and he came and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, lead this young man to the commander, for he has something to report to him. So he took him and led him to the commander and said, Paul, the prisoner, called me to him, and asked me to lead this young man to you, since he has something to tell you." The commander took him by the hand, and stepping aside, began to inquire of him privately, "What is it that you have to report to me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the council, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more thoroughly about him. So do not listen to them. For more than 40 of them are lying in wait for him, who have bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink until they slay him. And now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you." So the commander let the young man go, instructing him, "Tell no one that you have notified me of these things." Do you think God had a hand in this? See, here's that providence that I was talking about. That as this plan is being formed to kill Paul, that it just so happens that Paul's nephew hears what's going on. And the message is relayed from Paul through his nephew to the commander. And I want to talk about next here the choice, because in reality, I think you would agree, now the commander has a choice to make. He really has three options. The first option, he could let them carry out their plan, and he could let them kill Paul. It'd probably be less headache on him. He wouldn't have to deal with it anymore. He knows about the plot. Not a lot of people know about the plot. He could let them go forward. He could let them kill Paul. That was one option that he had. Or he could fight them off. He could kill the mob and be done away with it that way. Again, it would probably be less headache on him. Or the third and wise thing to do, he could move Paul. He could snatch Paul away. He could move Paul and get him out of this dangerous situation without anyone having to die. And fortunately, that is the decision that he makes. Let's go on here in our text in verse 23, talk about provisions that are being ordered. In verse 23, it says, "And he called to him 2 of the centurions and said, 'Get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen.' They were also to provide mounts to put Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor." So again, there's provisions that are ordered. Again, I want to ask you, Lysias has this decision to make. He can let them kill Paul. He can kill the mob. Again, either way, they would be out of his hair. Or he could do the right thing and just move Paul. Here's again my question. Do you think that God is working in this situation? The answer to that is yes, by the way. You can shake your head like this. God is working in this situation. Is he doing it miraculously? The answer is no. He's not doing it through miracle. He's doing it through, our word again, providence. God providentially is working to protect his servant, Paul. So there are these provisions that are ordered here in verses 23 and 24 so that the commander, that Lysias, can get him away from this situation. Let's go on here, next slide, starting in verse 25 in our text. It says, "And he wrote a letter having this form, 'Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. When this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And wanting to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. And I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. When I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to bring charges against him before you.'" So again, Captain Lysias here, he's not only has he rescued, he's commanded that Paul be rescued from this situation providentially. He's made the right decision. He's gotten Paul out of there. Again, God working through providence. Now he's writing this letter to the governor. Again, I feel it's God's providence. And then also later, starting in verse 31, we see that Paul arrives safely. It says, "So the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. But the next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with him, they returned to the barracks. When these had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. When he had read it, he asked from what province he was. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, 'I will give you a hearing after your accusers arrive also, giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. And so again, we see that God is working through providence. And as we get ready to close out here in just a minute, there is a point that I want to make, and I've been drilling it into your mind for a reason, because I feel this is the most practical application that we could possibly make. And here is the application. Sometimes we look at the Bible. We look at what God did for Paul. We look at the way that through the book of Acts and again on through the rest of the book in chapter 28, we're going to see again that Paul is always being protected. We see Peter in prison and being released. We see all these different situations in the Bible where God works and he protects his people, sometimes through miracle, but again in this case through providence, through natural occurrences. Here is the last application and we'll close out. In the same way that God through Paul, through natural occurrences, are protecting him and restoring him, not miraculously but providentially, God is perfectly illustrating that those who will put themselves, that will place themselves in a situation where they're doing his will first. I want to ask you this question. What are you living for today? What are you living for? Who are you living for? Are you living for yourself? Are you living for self-pleasure? Are you living through what the world can give you? Because I promise you, if you do that, you may think that you're happy. But here's a statement I want to make. No matter how rich you are poor without Jesus being Lord, Master of your life. Who are you living for? And this is a promise not from me, but from God. If you will insert yourself into a situation where you are living for him and you're going about his will to the very, very, very best of your ability, God is going to see to it that your labor is fruitful. God is going to see to it that through his providence, he's going to work through you. What do I mean by that? I mean this, that if you'll decide today that you're tired of being a person who doesn't share their faith, who has this grand message of Jesus, but doesn't want to share it with the world. If you're tired of being that person and you make a decision, I'm going to be all that God's called me to be. I'm going to live out my purpose. I'm going to fulfill his purpose and his will for my life. Because here's the thing, there are different things and ways God's going to work through all of us. But would you agree that all of our purposes are really one and the same? God put you here for a reason. That is to glorify him, to reach out to others, to share your faith, bring others into the kingdom of God. The promise is this: if you will dedicate yourself to being that person, saying, God, you are my master. Jesus, I live for you. God's promise is this: he will work through you. He will make sure that your labor is not in vain. It will be fruitful. You want to reach people? You'll reach people. I promise. You want to live faithfully to God with all of your heart? You're going to live faithfully because he's going to make sure that it happens. If you will seek first the kingdom, if you will place yourself in a situation where you are doing everything in your power to live a life for Jesus, God's promise is that providentially he is going to work through you and he will make sure that your labor is fruitful. I hope that you've enjoyed Acts chapter 23, and of course we're going to offer up a song of invitation. Maybe you've never become a Christian. Maybe you've heard this preaching of Jesus and you want to know what that's all about. Let's talk about it. We can baptize you into Christ. We can add you to the kingdom just as the gospel story commands us to do. We can do that. Maybe you're already a Christian. Maybe you're stumbling. Maybe there's something going on. I've been talking to some people lately and they feel like they're in a rut because of everything that's going on. Maybe you're in a rut. We can pray for you. We want to help you. We want to encourage you. Let's get together this week. We'll go grab something to drink. We'll grab lunch. We'll talk about it. We'll study the Bible together. Whatever you need, understand, I can't help you unless you tell me how I can help you. Let's get this thing right. If you're in need of anything at all, please come. As together we stand and as we sing.